So with that in mind, I'll ask Amanda to come up and we'll get started on our first presentation, which is entitled What to Look for and Do to Stop Fraud and Embezzlement of District Funds. And as it indicates in your packet, Amanda Danuta is an accountant auditor with the auditor's office, and she's a CPA and an internal auditor, and has been with the county for 2 years.
Hi everybody. Tonight, as Barbara said, I'm here to talk about what kinds of things.
We have printed out the PowerPoint for you. So those materials are in your packet and you can follow along in the Sorry.
That's okay. So tonight I'm here to talk about what kinds of things you can look for and do to prevent fraud in your special districts. The first slide here I have is Okay, let's try this again. So here's the first slide we have. This is just the definition of fraud, the dictionary definition. It's pretty straightforward and simple. As you go through the slides tonight, you'll see that there's actually a lot more to fraud. It comes in a lot of different shapes and sizes, and probably the best way to illustrate fraud is to just jump in and look at a case of fraud. So the case of Dixon, Illinois, this was actually publicized fairly well over the last year and a half, probably mostly in the spring of last year. Just to give you some quick facts about Dixon, Illinois, it's about 100 miles west of Chicago, about 16,000 people, just under 16,000, and they have an area of just under 8 square miles. So to put that in perspective, I've included some facts about Visalia. We have a population of just under 125,000, and our area is about 36 square miles. So you can see Dixon, Illinois is a very, very small city. And this will just go to show you what can happen even in a small city. And also, if you guys have any questions, I think there's a microphone floating around somewhere, so you can just feel free to jump in whenever. You guys don't have to stop me, just jump in. So in the city of Dixon, Illinois, there is a woman named Rita Crundwell. She started working for the city when she was in high school in the 1970s. She started as a clerk and eventually worked her way up to treasurer and comptroller. She was extremely well liked by her coworkers, and by the late 1980s, she pretty much had control of every financial aspect of the city. And even so much so that bank statements, she had them to where they were sent to a P.O. box, and she was the one in control of that P.O. box. And even when she was on vacation, she would have relatives pick up the bank statements, so they never really went through anybody else. Then if we fast forward to April of last year, she was arrested by the FBI because she embezzled $53 million from the city. So if you keep in mind just how small that city was, that's a large amount for anybody's, but especially when you think about how small that city was. And about 23 million of it was done in the first 15 or 16 years, and then she embezzled the rest in the last 6 years. So you can see that's about $5 million a year, and the city of Dixon only had an $8 million budget per year. So she's stealing pretty much all of their budget each year. What did she do with this money? Well, she did all sorts of things. She enjoyed a lavish lifestyle. She bought cars, boats, jewelry, and she had a very expensive hobby of breeding and competing quarter horses. When she was arrested, she had a bunch of these quarter horses, and they can be bought for up to $250,000 a piece. And while she was enjoying all this, obviously the city of Dixon was faced with a big cash flow crisis because she was taking most of their money. And then, obviously, the next question is, how can something like this happen and go undetected for so many years? So this is, excuse me, kind of a step-by-step of what she did with the funds and how she embezzled them. But basically, she went to one of the city's banks and she opened up a bank account, and she called it the RSCDA account, which stood for the Reserve Sewer Capital Development Account. And since it was a small town and the bank knew her, nobody really questioned her, and she was the only signer on the account. From here, she would transfer money from legitimate accounts that the city had into another account that the city had called the Capital Development Account. And then she created false invoices from the state, and then she paid those false invoices to her own account and deposited the checks in her own account. She made the checks out to treasurers so that anybody within the city of Dixon looking at the bank account would just think that she was paying the state treasurer, that they were going to the state of Illinois. So there was no red flags raised there. And then on the other end, when she deposited the checks into her created bank account, she was the treasurer for the city, so there were no red flags raised there because she was the only signer on the account and everybody just assumed that this was a city account. So from there, once she had the money in her account, she could do with it what she pleased. She withdrew it and then paid for all of her personal expenses. So what happened to Rita? Well, she went on an extended vacation in October of 2011, and from what I could gather, the relative that collected her mail, I guess since she was gone for so long, took it to the city office, and I don't know whether she gave it to the person who had taken over her duties or if it just somehow came across that person's desk. But they came across the bank statement for the secret account, thought the stuff in the account was unusual, and they took that to the mayor, and then the mayor brought in the FBI. So that was in October of 2011, but it wasn't actually until April that she was arrested. So both the mayor and the clerk had to continue to work with her for the next 6 months and keep that quiet while the FBI investigated. In May of last year, she was indicted for stealing $53 million. In June of last year, the city of Dixon sued both of their external auditors, or accounting firms, and Fifth Third Bank as well. And then in November of last year, Rita pled guilty to stealing the money. February of this year, she was sentenced to, I think it was actually 19 years and 7 months in federal prison. And so she'll be about, if she serves all of that, she'll be about 80 by the time she gets out. And then in September of this year, Dixon received a settlement from the two accounting firms and the bank for professional negligence. And actually, I think it was the smaller accounting firm and the bank each had to pay $1.5 million, and then the large accounting firm had to pay $27 million. So they've recovered $40 million from that. And then I think in selling all of Rita's assets, they've only recovered about $10 million of the 53 that she stole. So that's just an example of how wrong fraud can go, and just how detrimental it can be to a city. So you guys have any questions on that? Anybody? No? Next, I'll go into the different kinds of frauds that there are. 3 different kinds of frauds. We have asset misappropriation schemes, which are when an employee steals resources from the organization, like cash or assets. You have your corruption schemes, which are like bribery or kickbacks, and then financial statement fraud is when an employee, usually somebody higher up, alters the financial statements intentionally. Here is a chart of just all the different kinds of fraud there are. Those 3 categories that I just mentioned. There's tons and tons of different kinds of fraud, so I won't go through them all, but if you guys have any questions about any of the specific ones, you can feel free to ask. This shows the frequency, how each kind of fraud, how often it happens. So you can see the asset misappropriation is the most common one that occurs, followed by corruption and financial statement fraud. And it makes sense too if you look back at the other chart, because obviously there's the most different kinds of asset misappropriation. And then the next thing we have is how much is lost by each type of fraud. So even though financial statement fraud doesn't account for as much frequency-wise, it accounts for a considerable amount when you look at the median loss amount, and then it's followed by corruption and asset misappropriation. So if you think about the frequency and the loss together, then your financial statement fraud and asset misappropriation are definitely costing organizations the most. Okay, and then we have the fraud triangle, which is something you learn about, I think, in every accounting class. That just presents the basic 3 elements that have to be present in order for fraud to occur. So you have pressure, opportunity, and rationalization. Pressure is essentially what makes somebody want to commit the fraud, whether they feel like they have some perceived pressure because they can't pay their bills, or they have a drug or gambling addiction. Maybe, like in Rita's case, she had a desire for status symbols. She wanted to show that she could have a nice car, a nice house, buy nice things for her family, that kind of stuff. Next is the opportunity aspect. This is what allows you to be able to commit the fraud. So the person has to see some area that they can exploit in the organization that they can use to their advantage to commit the fraud. And typically this is going to be something that they don't feel like they're going to get caught, because if there's a high perceived risk, they're probably not going to take advantage of that. And then the third part of the fraud triangle is rationalization. And this is the person has to be able to rationalize to themselves that it's okay for them to commit fraud. A lot of times the person doesn't feel like they've really done anything wrong. They feel like they're justified in doing it. Maybe they've worked at their organization for a long time and they think, oh, I'm entitled to this, or I was passed over for this job or raise or promotion, and so I can steal this money. I'm entitled to it. Or they might be providing for their family, or they might even have bills that are due today but they don't get paid till next week, so they think, I'm just going to borrow this money and then I'll pay it back. So in their minds they rationalize it to where they're not really doing anything wrong. So those are the 3 things, pressure, opportunity, and rationalization, that are always present when fraud occurs. So keeping that in mind, then we have the next set of 3 things, which are fighting fraud. And the 3 critical areas there are prevention, detection, and response. So how can fraud be prevented? Well, as we've seen so far, there's a lot of different kinds of fraud. So there's not a really one-size-fits-all kind of a solution. Something to keep in mind is internal controls are always key. Those are going to help fraud from occurring. And then management and board members are also really important, because they have a role to make sure that good internal controls exist and that your organization has some kind of fraud prevention practices in place. So the next few slides are just some control measures to consider. Obviously, every special district is different, so some of these suggestions or ideas might not apply to everybody. They might not even be feasible, but they're just examples of things that can be done to maybe add extra protection to the organization. So, dual signatures and authorizations. Anytime you have more layers of approval being required, that makes it harder for somebody to commit fraud, sorry. A good idea is to, if you have expenditures, anytime they're over a predetermined amount, you could require 2 signatures. Maybe even one of those can be from the board. With credit cards, if there's a possibility of big purchases occurring, maybe require the person to get approval beforehand and estimate those costs. Another thing is for credit card statements and bank statements, it might be a good idea to have a duplicate copy sent to a board member's home. This way you know you're getting the original statement and that it hasn't been altered by the time it comes to you. Another important thing is to always require backup documentation. So anytime you have any kind of cash disbursements, you need to make sure that there's some kind of documentation to support that. And if possible, invoices of disbursement requests should be authorized by an individual that's not signing the check. And of course, you should only pay from original invoices. Another thing is, don't ever pre-sign your checks. And if possible, don't have signature stamps at all. But for both of these things, your check stock, and if you have to have a signature stamp, always make sure that they're locked away and secure. Segregation of duties. This one was something that was definitely lacking in that first story we looked at in Dixon, Illinois. You never want one person to be responsible for an entire financial transaction. So whether that's money coming in or money going out, you shouldn't have the person being in charge of signing checks, dispersing funds, reconciling bank statements, receipt of funds. Just all that stuff needs to be divided up. If an organization doesn't have enough staff members to have proper segregation of duties, you can always consider having a board member maybe reconcile bank statements, something to think about. Another thing is require employees to take regular vacations if you can. A lot of times this is when fraud will come to light, when somebody's not there to cover their tracks. And also if you have somebody else take over their duties, then that's also probably going to lead to any type of fraud if it is being committed, being brought to light. I think my clicker is died. Sorry. Yeah. Try it. Yeah. Oh no. That one. Yeah. Okay. Continuing on. This one's not always feasible either, but if you can conduct background checks, that's good. I think I actually read one story in my research where somebody was, were committing fraud, and then when they looked at their background, they had actually been doing the same thing at a previous job. So if the second job had performed a background check, then, obviously they probably would have hired that person, and that could have been prevented. Another thing is make sure there's a fair bidding process. This is going to stop things like bribery and kickbacks, or at least hopefully prevent some of them. Contracts above a certain amount should be subject to 3 bids and approved by somebody that's not involved in the transaction, and then large contracts should always be reviewed by the board. Another thing is make sure you do inventories of your fixed assets. This is large equipment and then smaller equipment as well, like computers or printers. Just want to make sure that things aren't, coming up missing and just walking away after a year or a couple of years. Thank you. Another thing to consider is just make sure that, this one's big, make sure you're monitoring and reconciling your bank accounts regularly. This way you're going to catch any issues that there are, and you'll catch them before any further damage occurs. Okay, so those are some of the things to prevent fraud, but if it does occur, then how do you detect it? Well, there's a lot of different ways that fraud can be detected. The most common one is through tips. And then a common misconception is that these financial audits that we have every year, the external auditor, it's not actually their job to catch fraud. They're just there to make sure that the information that's presented in your financial statements is accurate. So if they, in the course of their regular testing to do that, they come across something, then of course they would report it, but they're not coming into your organization specifically looking for fraud, and it's not their job to find it. This is just a chart kind of showing you a breakdown of the different methods of fraud detection. So as you can see there, tips are count for almost half of it. And we actually have a fraud hotline here at Tulare County. It's fairly new, but that's a way that if your districts wanted to report fraud, they could do that, report it to our fraud hotline. Because sometimes people might not feel, like if you have employees, maybe they don't feel comfortable coming to the board, or if they know that management's committing fraud, this is a way that they could report that. So it's something to think about. So there's some different kinds of things you can do to try and detect fraud, or there's some red flags that can be raised sometimes. And just because these are present doesn't always mean that fraud's being committed, but these are just some things that are unusual and to look out for. Unusual behavior. Sorry. If the person displays any kind of unusual behavior, like they get really irritable anytime you ask them questions, or if they never take vacations, like it's the person who never takes vacation at the holidays, like they're always there. It might be because they're trying to cover some fraud scheme that they're committing. If you're always asking for documents and they seem to be missing without explanation, or they can't be given to you right then, or you have to wait for them, that's kind of unusual. If documents are regularly missing, you might want to make sure that there's explanations for that. Another thing, if you have sales in your organization, excessive voids can be a sign of fraud. So this means that a sale's rung up and then the perpetrator keeps the money and then voids the transaction so that there's no evidence at the end of the day with the cash being off. And along those same lines are excessive credit memos. This is where the employee will take cash and then write a credit memo to a phony customer just to cover their tracks. If you have bank reconciliations that are done and you notice there's increasing reconciling items, like bank errors or deposits in transit or checks that haven't been cashed, if these things increase over time and they're not going away, that can be a red flag because they usually should resolve themselves over a month or so. And then another one to look for is if your general ledger is out of balance. And then if you try to prevent fraud, detect it, and it happens, the last element is your response, what to do when fraud is suspected. So obviously don't overreact, don't make any spontaneous allegations. As we saw in the first example of Dixon, Illinois, they had to wait 6 months after they found out about the fraud before anything happened. So, you know, you might suspect fraud, but you might not be accurate about it. So always gather more information to make sure that, you know, what you suspect is true. And then, depending on what the fraud is, you might want to report it to somebody, whether that's the police or our county fraud hotline. And then after you've taken care of all that, it's good to review what happened so you can figure out how to prevent it from happening again, determine any areas that there's internal control weaknesses and what can be strengthened to prevent future incidents. So some specific areas of concern for special districts. Sometimes don't always have the most funds available, so maybe you don't have a full staff and that makes it harder to have segregation of duties, or you don't have anti-fraud programs in place, so you don't have an internal audit department. I think just being aware of where the weaknesses are, and that can just be really helpful because then you kind of know how the system can be taken advantage of. Just knowing that and trying to do what you can to put things in place to stop that is really helpful. Another thing is sometimes maybe the board members have known management forever, like maybe management has worked there for a really long time. They're more trusting of them, or they think, oh, it's okay that I don't understand this because so-and-so has worked here forever, so they know what they're doing. You know, just don't be always so trusting. You know, just make sure you ask questions and that you do understand what's going on. And then I think I brought this up already, but there's a belief that your financial statement audit is that the external auditor will catch any fraud. Just be aware that that's not always the case. If they come across it, of course, they're going to report it to you. But again, they're not there to find fraud. So the role of the board in fighting fraud, just make sure that decisions are made soundly, that you think that management is trained in putting the organization's interests, their best interests ahead of their own. Make sure that there's a hands-on oversight of management, that you understand what's going on, that you ask questions, and that you're ensuring that policies and procedures are followed. And then it's always good if one board member has some relevant financial experience. So that's the end of this presentation. Hopefully you just kind of got a little bit more information and are aware of some things and where issues can occur. If you guys have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, Kim is going to present next on different kinds of banking, new banking. Okay, thank you.